Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Practice-Based Publishing, Getting Your Public Health Findings Out into the World, Part 3, Methods and Results. My name is Dani Zemmel, and I'm the Project Coordinator for the Region 5 Public Health Training Center. This webinar is offered in partnership with the Journal for Public Health Management and Practice Direct, and also with the American Public Health Association's Health Administration section. This third session in the four-part series will explore how to describe the methods used in your work and also how to write about your findings. Before we begin, a little bit of information about us. The Region 5 PHTC is part of the National Public Health Learning Network. With 9 other training centers across the country, we seek to strengthen the skills of the current and future public health workforce through continuing education and student development. We encourage you to check out our other training offerings on our catalog at rvphtc.org. So as we have as people are joining us today, we're going to take a moment to go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please add your questions or comments into the chat box. We will not be using the Q&A or raise hand functions in this webinar. Depending on the question, we may type an answer back to you directly in the chat, or we may save it for the Q&A portion at the end. And we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. The slides were sent out in a reminder email earlier today. There is no CE offered for this training. And the recording and slides will be available in the coming weeks, and we will send out a notification once the on-demand version is available. And now I would like to welcome Justin Moore, the Associate Professor of Implementation Science at the Wake Forest School of Medicine and the Associate Editor of JPHMP. Justin?
Thank you, Dani. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce our panelists. The first is Valerie Yeager. Dr. Yeager is Assistant Professor at Indiana University Fairbanks School of Public Health and is an editorial board member for the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice. Our other panelist is Gulzar Shah. Dr. Shah is Professor and Department Chair of the Jianping Su College of Public Health at Georgia Southern University. He's a consulting editor for the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice. And both of our panelists are longtime colleagues who I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from. Next slide, please. So just a brief recap on what we've learned. I hope you've been able to follow along. If not, the prior lectures or webinars have been recorded. But just a brief look back. So in webinar 2, we talked about topic selection, and it was really around, what is that gap that your manuscript, your paper is filling? What is that thing that when you started your project, you really wish you could have gone to a journal or gone to a website someplace and learned about? What that's going to be the thing that you're contributing with your study. Is that, I wish I knew something about what I'm doing before I did it, and that's what you're going to fill. Because that way it's meaningfully adding to the body of literature. It's going to help advance practice in a way that is. We're having a little speaker problem. I'll speak up. What will you be adding to the body of literature? What are you going to? How are you going to prove practice through your publishing? We talked a bit about outline and background. So, how do you outline your topic and start putting together your justification so that the reader of your paper really understands what's important, where this came from, what was known about the topic prior to your paper, and then what is going to be known. And, how do you build a team around this? So how can you bring on partners who will help, get you from that blank screen, that Word document with the blinking cursor, and will get you to a point where you have, a good outline for your paper and a good background. Can you start small and build on that? We talked about like our writing in boxes tool on our companion site, JPHMP Direct. It will help walk you through the steps to build an outline. And the other things that our panelists talked about was, can you reach out to maybe your academic partners those who have a bit more time in their day to do this type of academic writing and bring them on board. And then generally, we talked about finding time for publishing. How in the world, with so much going on, the day-to-day challenges and the emerging threats that we face in public health, how do you find time for publishing? And it's really around, you can't create hours in the day, we don't have a time machine, but we can hopefully block off periods of time and dedicate those to writing and give yourself achievable tasks that you can target during that block. It may be an hour, it may be at 7 in the morning before people get into the office, but how do you block off that time and give yourself incremental steps that help build the bigger piece? So please, if you didn't have a chance to check that webinar out, it is available. Next slide, please. So today we're going to advance on that by discussing how to write qualitative methods sections and kind of important reminders of what needs to be included. We're going to discuss best practices and flawed practice in writing quantitative methods. What's a good example, what's a bad example. Also, we're going to talk about sound and flawed ways to write quantitative study results and discuss different presentation options for your qualitative results and quantitative results section. Next slide. So with that, I would like to hand it off to Dr. Shah, who will talk about what is practice-based research and why is that relevant to writing up your results. Dr. Shah?
Thank you, Dr. Moore, and welcome. The practice-based research has not been, it's been variously defined. So here is some contextual information for some of our slides and to make a connection with the broader topic of, practice-based publishing. And this is based on a couple of papers I co-authored with doctors Glenn Mays and Kay Loveless. So for the researchers to be able to engage in practice-based research, the topic should not come from researchers' own curiosity, or worse, not through data peeking, because some of us, have access to the secondary data and formulate questions later or pick the topic based on data picking. They should arise from the practice needs. So ideally, in a practice-based research, the researcher works with a practitioner. So the research questions emerge from public health practices needs. And as I said, preferably the topics should be co-selected by researchers and practitioners. Data should comprise practice-generated observations. Study design should be decided through practitioner-researcher collaboration, because obviously, if it's a practice-based research, the methods should be understandable, at least to the practitioners, by the practitioners. And other study methods, they should be understandable, and particularly the methods and ideally the entire research manuscript should be jargon-free, which means that it should not use the terms that are only understandable by people in the certain narrower field. So finding must have clear public health practice and policy implications, and not just academic exercise. Results should be written in practice-friendly language. And I know that the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice has done things to make sure people do write their practice and policy implications. And as I said, there's one source given, and the other article that I said is, Shah, G.H. Loveless, K. Mays, G. Diffusion of practice-based research in local public health. What differentiates adopters from non-adopters? It's published in the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice in 2012, and we will be happy to share the full citation. So next slide, and Dr. Yeager, please take on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. This is the beginning of the qualitative methods section of today's presentation, and I want to start with a reminder that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So while it may feel like what you're approaching writing is something that is almost insurmountable, just remind yourself that others have written these types of papers before, and there are examples out there that can help you. And I'll show you a number of examples and ways of thinking about how to write a qualitative method section, as well as qualitative findings throughout my presentation today. Next slide. So in brief, methods is about describing what you've done and your approaches. And it's with the purpose of setting the reader up for the findings that they're going to see soon, but it's also to give people a good understanding of what you did. The reader then knows through the details that you provide in the methods how you went about your project. And while you may feel like what you did is complicated, and when you start to, scratch it out on paper for yourself, it looks a little bit like the diagram in the bottom left where we did all of these things and it's so very complicated. If you think of it more as a recipe, it's easier to map how you get from point A to point B. And ultimately, writing manuscripts is in and of itself a recipe. There are sections. There is clear guidance as to what goes in each of those sections. And so I'll start with the overview statement in the methods. Next slide. At the beginning of each method section, typically I'll write a sentence that describes in brief what the study is and how I went about doing it. So you'll give some indication of study design. For a qualitative study, it may be longitudinal, but it's more likely a cross-sectional study. So it was data collected at one point in time rather than over time. It's also typically primary data, but there is secondary qualitative data that's available for analysis. And so you would want to note that, not describe it fully yet, but to give a basic understanding of what is coming in your paper. So I have an example from one of my previous manuscripts, and the citations for each of the manuscripts that I use as examples is at the bottom of the slide. In this paper, I started by saying, through qualitative data, we obtained the perspectives of individuals who lead HIE research and evaluation projects. So who and what were we interested in? This cross-sectional study, the study design, was conducted in the year following national funding for HIE research studies. So very brief, to the point, gives folks a sense this is a qualitative study and it's cross-sectional. And you have a sense of who I was studying. Next. After your overview statement, you typically describe your sample and your recruitment. So you're going to describe the population that you're studying and provide justification for why that population was selected. You'll explain who was selected, how they were invited to participate in any exclusion or inclusion criteria, how those individuals were identified and recruited. Is it a convenience sample? Is it a snowball sample? How did you go about identifying those individuals? Note any incentives that are provided for participation in the research. And if you used secondary data rather than primary data, you want to provide an understanding of how that data came to be. So if NACCHO collected the data, or ASTO or Public Health WINS collected the data, then you'll just simply have a statement that says secondary data is from Public Health WINS 2017. More information about data collection can be available at the following link. And then you've basically cited that secondary source, and others can go and read more about it if they want to. So the example I provide comes from that same article that I used on the last overview statement. We used a convenience sample approach aimed at achieving saturation and identified potential participants based on contributions to the HIE literature. So we selected people who we knew were contributing to the literature. Consideration was given to ensure that the sample included participants with experiences from geographically diverse areas of the US, local and national evaluations, and researchers who were working with different types of HIEs. So we're trying to give a sense of who are the people and how did we identify them. Next slide. You'll also want a section that describes your instrument. So if you're conducting focus groups or if you're conducting qualitative interviews, you'll have an instrument that's guiding that work. And you're going to need to explain how that instrument was created. If you're using other people's work to inform the development, you'll explain that and cite those other sources. You'll more than likely describe the categories of information that you're touching on in your interview or your focus group. And you may even give a summary statement and how many questions are included in your instrument. This example comes from a different paper and the citation is at the bottom. The interview protocol was designed to investigate the healthcare organization's reasons for participating or not participating in LAHI. The decision process to participate, their impressions and knowledge of HIEs, which stands for Health Information Exchange, if that's a new term for you, the perceived benefits of participating in HIEs and experiences with HIEs. So I'm giving a summary of these are the types of things I'm asking about in my interviews. You can do that by providing an appendix and having the interview guide in the appendix to your article. Typically, you don't want to use one of your tables as your interview instrument. You're going to need that space in your tables for other things, but if you have the room for it, you could include it as an appendix. Next slide. And then every method section has an analysis section or subsection. So this section is a little bit harder to write, but it can be simplified. How did you do your work? So how did you code and what was your approach to coding? If you're using a specific approach like grounded theory or inductive coding, you would explain that. You would also describe who did the coding. So eventually you'll typically list author initials in parentheses, but if you're submitting a blinded manuscript, you'll just say something like 2 of the authors conducted all coding. And then once it's gone through the review process, you can add those initials in for the authors that you're referring to that conducted the coding. You'll want to note anything about how you validated the findings through inter-rater reliability, which is essentially a mechanism for seeing how consistent individual coders were in coding materials. It does require that you use a software that can calculate inter-rater reliability. And many of us don't have access to those softwares. So I'm thinking of Atlas TI or NVivo. If that's the case, you can discuss consistency in coding without using inter-rater reliability if it's not available to you. So I give an example down below. 2 researchers coded the data, starting with a priori codes or codes that were identified in advance. Sub-themes were generated following an initial review of the interviews. Each interview was then coded by both researchers. Findings were compared with differences discussed and resolved collectively. So in this statement, I'm implying that we had 100% agreement because if we differed in how we coded, we discussed it and came to an agreement about it. At the end of your analysis section, you'll want to add an IRB statement. Sometimes an IRB statement will be that IRB wasn't required. If, say, for example, you're conducting organizational research and you're asking people their opinion about the use of a new program or their perceived benefits of a new intervention, if it doesn't have the potential of human risk involved in your study, your IRB will probably deem that work exempt. If that's the case and you don't have an IRB number to go with it, you could simply say this study was reviewed by whichever IRB at our organization and was deemed exempt from human subjects research. And then you have a statement. If you've gotten IRB approval and it is, say, expedited, you could simply say the study was approved by the IRB at Indiana University. Next slide. An important note is that you do not want to include results in your methods section. So I give a little bit of a specific example here. If you use predetermined themes, what we often call a priori themes for your qualitative coding, you should explain those themes in the methods section and what informed them. If you have some citations of how you developed your a priori codes, that goes in your methods section. They helped design your guide. They helped you decide on your guide, and you'll code according to some of those. However, if the codes are not determined in advance, then actually determining those themes is a finding, and that gets presented in the finding section. So you don't want to describe your themes, if that's part of the finding, until you get to the results section. Next slide. I'll turn it back to Dr. Shaw at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Yeager. So in the next few slides, I will describe considerations and precautions in quantitative methods and results. You will probably notice some redundancy, but that's by design, because there are some things that are applicable to both qualitative and quantitative methods. I will try to skip some details about some things that's been covered adequately, that they equally apply to both. So with that, I just wanted to say that, in my own work, when I'm under pressure to complete a manuscript, sometimes I'm tempted to skip some of the details. So one of the ways to deal with that is to maybe use this checklist. So as the checklist applies, make sure you have talked about your study design, the setting, the participants, the data, instrumentation, description of variables, statistical methods, ethical considerations. And I'm going to, provide some details about these in next few slides. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about study design first. So, I will not be able to give you a full kind of description of what are, all aspects of study design. But, here are some examples. Like, you got to make sure that you talk about whether your study is quantitative, qualitative, is it observational versus experimental, is it descriptive, or is it inferential in nature? And based on the direction of exposure, is it a cohort study or like another type, which is like backward tracing, also called case control studies? And then you can also talk about whether it's cross-sectional, longitudinal, and another dichotomy to consider is it in certain designs, is it prospective versus retrospective design? So these are some quick examples. If you need to know more about them, I would, basically encourage folks to read about them more. Okay, so moving on, we should also describe the setting. It's important. It was said earlier, describing as applicable the research, context, the location is important. Provide all relevant dates, for example, the recruitment date, the exposure dates, if that's applicable, follow-up dates, if that's applicable, and data collection dates for sure, if it's whatever type of data, I guess it applies to all. Then also describing study participants is important. And the related elements, such as what was the target population, what was the sampling design, where did the sampling frame come from, what was the sampling frame, what was the size of the sample, and the sample selection method. All of those details should be covered. Make sure to include details about data, indicate if the data are primary or secondary, and provide details about data collection. And that would include instrumentation, mode of data collection, time frame for data collection, response rates, and so forth. And next slide, please. Okay, so about data collection instrument, you ought to give enough detail about data collection instrument as it applies to your research. For example, for surveys, discuss the questionnaire and the theoretical constructs or topics covered by the questionnaire. Describe if and how pre-testing was done of your instrument. And then, as possible, discuss any strategies to test the validity and reliability of the instrument. And then I'm not going to go into details, but as discussed earlier, IRB considerations should be mentioned. And if there are any potential biases, what were the ways you adopted to address them? Next slide, please. Okay, another important thing in your methods write-up is to include sufficient description of your variables and measures. And I have seen people going like to one extreme or the other, like you don't want to over describe them, but you have to give sufficient detail so that folks who are your readers and reviewers would know if your for your variables, if the statistical methods or other things are appropriate, and is the measurement is it good for, or appropriate is the word that I was looking for. Is it appropriate given your questions and your hypothesis? So some of the things to consider is if it's, for example, a survey, then you ought to say what questions led to a variable or a set of questions. How were the variable or variables coded, and how, if any, new variables were computed, and talk about level of measurement if there is room in terms of your word limit, because level of measurement is what basically helps you and readers assess whether or not your statistical methods are appropriate. So when we talk about levels of measurement, we are talking about nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Okay, and this one, the next point is really, really important. What assumptions were made and how did you check them is important to state. This is extremely important. As I said, I have seen results dramatically change, particularly in several studies that I've seen where I have a count variable and then, I try a Poisson regression and I look at the results. And then when I check the assumptions, I find that one of the main assumptions, it's called over dispersion. If over dispersion happens, like the variance is greater than the mean, then you got to opt for maybe negative binomial. And also, I'm not going to go into more detail, but what I was going to say is that the results dramatically changed. And I initially was really saying, really, can we change the results as much? And then I said, not really, if we follow the procedures of checking the assumptions religiously and then making sure the appropriate methods are selected. Quickly, I would say you got to mention what statistical software used and properly referencing it, and what's the time frame for the analysis, giving the date. Next slide, please. Okay, so Now let's talk about some of the quick hints about writing up the methods. But I won't go into a lot of details in this slide. But all I would say is if there are flaws in the methodology, you cannot really make up for those flaws through just basically better description or good write-up. And so it's hard to get away with the results that are, as I show in this example, the research question is, does smoking during pregnancy results in low birth weight births? And if the data are 20, for example, a total of 20 qualitative interviews, you can't really make assess associations appropriately, and particularly can't make causation statements. Please, next slide. Okay, so another set of hints which was covered by my colleague is that you got to write with clarity, and then make sure your arguments flow well from one section to another. Ask yourself, does it tell your story well? And are you telling the story in a coherent way? And it was said earlier that don't mix your methods in results. And conversely, do not mix your results in your method section. I've seen this mistake made several times where people would forget to write their methods and then they end up writing the methods in the results section. Show patience. My own experience is when I do that, or when I fail to do that, I end up creating a lot more work coming from the reviews and the rejections. Next slide, please. Okay, so another quick set of tips is that think reproducibility. In other words, when you write your methods, provide enough detail that someone else can basically, if they have the data, they can reproduce your results. So in addition to generalizability, which comes from your research design, sampling, and population, and other things having to do with your methods, be sure to think about reproducibility, meaning that you should include the details on everything that one needs to know. And another important tip is, a lot of times I've heard colleagues say, hey, I didn't find anything in my results, meaning that there is no significance, sometimes referred to as negative findings. It's important to actually report negative findings. I know that we are less likely to be published. I guess some people say that. If we don't report significant findings, but depending upon your field, depending upon what you are testing, sometimes non-significant results tell you more than significant results. So I'll leave it at that. But finally, I want to say I've seen many young researchers and my students make this mistake. They find reverse findings, meaning findings that are opposite to what's existing in the field. And I say it's fine, you can report those findings, but make sure the direction of your coding is right. That's a mistake so often made, where people would code yes is equal to 0 and no is equal to 1, and then they think that they are interpreting the results for yes, but actually it's the reverse direction. Next slide, please. Okay, and now some cautions. I will be quick through this. Do not under-describe the methods. In other words, things that are already said, provide those details, but do not over-describe. And also, one mistake that I've seen some people make is that they discuss pros and cons of other methods that are not used during the study. This is not a textbook chapter, so when you're writing a manuscript, so do not try to discuss other methods and then say, okay, this is a method I use. Another quick tip is that do not self-plagiarize, because when you write something and you publish, you still have to rephrase, and you still have to maybe definitely properly cite it, give the proper reference. If you don't do that, you are self-plagiarizing. So that's something you want to avoid. The next slide, please. Okay, so in the next a couple of slides, actually 3 slides, I will talk about some quick checklists of results, and also some do's and do nots. So you should present your descriptive results, but that does not mean that you describe every detail or variable in the descriptive table. I've seen both extremes. Some folks would say all the descriptive results are given in table 1. And that may, or mostly it may not be acceptable, because there are some primary independent and dependent variable. You should describe them or consider describing them. And also, do not over describe your descriptive results, meaning that things that are presented in descriptive tables, they should not be, maybe not all of them needs to be reported. And then after the descriptive results, when you do report main results, provide sufficient details. I will basically talk about how to organize your results in the next couple of slides. But one thing I wanted to say is that provide sufficient details, such as if you are reporting odds ratios, make sure you mention your reader knows whether they are unadjusted or adjusted estimates, or when we say adjusted, that means confounder adjusted estimates, meaning if they are adjusted for other variables in the model. And then report other analysis. So sometimes it looks odd to provide the needed details, and I'll give you an example later on. But sometimes, often without those needed details, your reader will not be able to understand what you're saying. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll try to go through this slide quickly. There is often a question that comes my way from my students. How do I organize my results? And researchers have shown preference in organization of results in 3 different conventions. One is to basically describe the most important findings first, and then describe the subsidiary findings. Another convention is to define a set of, to describe a set of findings and related subsidiary findings, and then present the second set of, when I say second set, it may be the next theme or next topic, and then the subsidiary findings and so forth. The third convention is to interpret the results in the order in which your tables, for example, and figures are presenting them. And they are not clearly contradictory to each other, but these are the 3 primary conventions, and what works for you, maybe you can choose. Also, make sure to read, if you are targeting a certain journal, see their preference. Okay, so, and also include subheadings where necessary, because sometimes paragraph after paragraph of results may not make sense to people. So I generally just give subheadings, such as, if there are a couple of topics within multivariable analysis, then I would list the topic, or if they are broken by descriptive and multivariable analysis, then I'll do that. So subheadings are important. Next slide, please. Okay, and when you are describing your results, be choosy. I don't need to go into details. And also another thing is to make sure you are consistent in use of tense. When you're describing your results, most people like to use past tense, but do not mix the tenses. And as I said, read the author instructions. Next slide, please. And so another thing to consider, another set of things to consider is be very, very careful with your tables and graphs. Tables are important. So one thing that to remember is that tables should be standalone, and therefore it's a good practice to provide footnotes, provide number of observations. Sometime it's better to state where did the p-value or where the coefficient came from. So provide the name of the statistical methods. And also I've also seen a mistake made by some students, and that is when they just say table 1 multivariate analysis, something like that. You got to give sufficient detail so that your reader would know what, who, when, where, and when. And as it applies, consider doing that. Next slide, please. Okay, in the next 2 to 3 slides, and which are my last slides, I will again tell you what to watch out for. So do not start the results by restating your method, something that was said earlier. And also do not editorialize your results, meaning if you have some comments about, okay, here are the results and what do they mean, what's the interpretation, save that for the discussion. And this is also not the section to explain what's the significance of your topic or your findings. That's also for discussion. And do not present results that are not included in the tables and figures. Sometimes I review manuscripts where I find statistical figures or results reported, and I can't really find them in figures and tables. That is not comfortable for me as a reviewer, and I'm pretty sure your readers don't like that. And sometime I've done that. I've presented things that are numbers that are not in my tables and graphs, and I say not presented in tables and figures, available upon request or whatever justifies not including. And finally, do not assume your reader is statistically savvy. Do not leave the statistical coefficient for them to interpret those results for your reader. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is one slide about basically making your variables and your results coherent or aligned with each other. A lot of times, some of us, students, others, rookies, make a mistake, and that is they forget what the measurement was, what was the variable, and then they move on to, when they are describing the results, they just end up describing something different. So given, for example, the variable is whether levels or level of perceived bias and hatred in COVID-19 era. There is the measurement question. If you have experienced acts of bias or hatred related to your race or skin color, how often has this happened since the onset of COVID-19? And then obviously there are choices for the, and so the acceptable is you provide details such as compared with which group? White students, the perceived risk of bias and hatred in the COVID-19 era was significantly higher for students with race identity as Black. The adjusted odds ratios having experienced bias or hatred since COVID-19 very often or fairly often versus never were considerably higher for students whose race was Black compared to white. So as you see, I've given several comparisons. I've given a comparison of race categories, and I've given a comparison of the outcome variable. So if I don't give that detail, that's not going to fly. So it's not going to be good enough. My last slide is that do not over describe your results, and do not say approached significance, because that's if it's not significant, it's not significant. So finally, do not include irrelevant tables. So that's all I had for the quantitative results and methods. Next slide, and Dr. Yeager, please take it over.
Okay, so we'll wrap up today's discussion of results by talking about how we present qualitative results. And for many practice-based projects, if you're using qualitative methods, you're doing so because you're looking for rich insights. And the qualitative results section is about presenting those insights, but getting to the point and using that as your simple explanation of what you found, and leaving the discussion of what the meaning is that goes with those findings for the discussion section. So don't editorialize in your results section. Examples of that are when you start a sentence by saying, interestingly, participants said. Interestingly is an editorial. You're giving us your opinion that you think it's interesting. That is for discussion. Another way of doing it is to say, this means that. And again, you're interpreting findings at that point, and you're saving that for your discussion section. So a good way to think about how to do this without editorializing is to read how others do it and use that to inform your own approach. Next slide, please. Qualitative insights require the use of quotes, and oftentimes that means a lot of word count is coming from your results section. If you're writing a research brief for the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice, you have 1,500 words total for your manuscript, and you only get one table. So one of the ways that qualitative researchers can ensure that those meaningful quotes get included is to put quotes in your tables. Your table word count does not count towards the total article word count. So it's a nice place to put meaningful quotes. You just have to find a way to make them fit in a table. I'll show you a few examples of different ways that I've done some of this. Next slide. So what I have in this first example comes from an article that is a research brief. This is a recent paper that I wrote with some of the colleagues that you've probably recognized. Dr. Leiter is one of the training center PIs, and so you've probably become familiar with him. And Chelsea Sari, who is a practitioner, and then Jessica Kronstadt, who's at the Public Health Accreditation Board. For this particular study, we were asked to look at what is it that makes those small local health departments that got accredited able to go through accreditation. We know that there are barriers to small agencies getting accredited. So what is it that allowed these small agencies to get accredited? Is there something we could learn from them? So we were asked to do some qualitative interviews. I conducted these interviews and had to write a research brief for this article. Now, because of the way it was funded, we were only allowed to do 9 interviews, which is a relatively small sample. And so a research brief was appropriate. What you can see in this, and it's a little bit hard to see, but I tried to put the one table I'm allowed to publish with a brief is where I have my themes, which were identified through the coding. And then the sub-themes and examples are on the right side of that table. So you've got a theme, each of the sub-themes, and a quote to describe the sub-theme. In the manuscript, if you're looking for an example of this, you've got the citation here. Next slide, please. The next example is using quotes throughout the text, and I provide another Journal of Public Health Management and Practice article where I embed quotes in my text. Now, I also have a table that goes with this one, and it does explain different quotes and some different themes, but throughout my text, I give examples using quotes. In this particular study, I highlight those things that I think are important for us to talk about. So the first category that I'm describing is an a priori category. I already knew that I was talking to folks about this topic of a minimum package of services. So I describe what individuals tell me about this minimum package of services. And then because it's a quote that's more than 3 lines long, it gets indented and it stands alone. Depending on the journal, they'll help you format these things. But if you have a sense of that, you can go ahead and write your submissions that way so that it's easier for your reviewers to discern between a quote versus your text. Next slide. And then this is where I use quotes throughout the text, and then I have a table that describes the themes and the sub-themes. In this particular table, I don't have any quotes at all. So one of the major findings of this work was the identification of the themes and the sub-themes. And in order to give clarity to what those sub-themes are, there are 3 columns in the table that I present in this paper. The first theme, the sub-theme, and then an explanation of what fits into that sub-theme. And then as a result of the table having the themes so clearly articulated, I embed quotes in the manuscript explaining people's examples that go with each of those sub-themes and give the appropriate context so that somebody else who's reading it can understand how that became its own sub-theme. You can see on the far left of my text of the paper that I describe my main themes as the very first part of my findings. I first say how many or who my interviews, findings from the interviews are summarized in table 1. And then I give the themes and I explain each of the themes. And I note that all the sub-themes are provided in table 1 with clarification for each of those themes. And then I begin talking through what each of these themes are, providing those quotes. Next slide. The quotes presented in your results need to be appropriate for what you're going to talk about in your conclusions. So this is something that I even get to my conclusions section and I'll sometimes say, oh, wait, did I talk about this in the results? I can't discuss this in the discussion if I don't provide that finding in the findings section. So you draft your findings section and then you work on your conclusions and your discussion, but you think about, did I present it this sufficiently to be able to have these discussion points in the discussion section? So I want, when I'm a reviewer and I'm reading somebody's work and I see discussion points that there weren't any findings about, that's the first thing as a reviewer that you're going to get feedback on. You can't talk about findings in the discussion that aren't presented in the findings. Next slide. I list the qualitative papers here for you if you want to take a look at any of these. The eGEMS article, the very first one, is an open access article. But if you have any problems accessing any of these, we can help you with that. I could share preprint versions and not infringe on copyright if needed. So let us know if we can help with any of your own development in that area. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you both so much. I just did want to also make a note for the JPHMP articles that we've discussed. I have made those available on the website for download for free in case you don't have access for 2 weeks. So get them now. But I have made the articles mentioned by Dr. Jonathan Vieira available for download in case you do not have a subscription. So if they aren't immediately available, give them some time, but they will be open for the next 2 weeks. Um, so let's get to some questions here. We have some in the chat. The first one is for Dr. Yeager regarding iterator reliability. So you said determine which authors code the data by eventually listing initials in parentheses. So for the authors doing the coding, why would you only want to include the initials in self-reviewed? Is there a specific reason that do you just have the initials there, or is that just customary?
So typically your coders are authors on the manuscript. So you're just indicating to a reader which of the authors conducted the coding. Usually people who are coding for you are contributors to a manuscript. If you have a lot of coders who you want to acknowledge but didn't contribute to the research, then that would be unusual. But for the most part, their initials align with the authors that are in the manuscript. If I have 5 or 6 authors, more than likely we didn't all code. So you're just identifying which of the team members conducted the coding. Did I answer each of those parts?
I think that makes sense to me, especially in the context of journals that have double blinding as well. You wouldn't want to fully list out authors because it would indicate that there is double blinding where the reviewers don't know who the authors are. That would also come into play. But yeah, that makes sense to me. But if it does not, please enter into the chat any questions. Great, looks like that worked. Other questions? I'm not seeing any unless you are.
I haven't seen any other questions come in, but one thing I'm interested in is if we could maybe have a little bit of information about what are some comments that you receive in their review process after you've submitted your paper, comments specifically geared towards the methods and results sections, things to improve.
So a challenge with qualitative findings is that sometimes journals will ask me to say how many people said the following types of things. And this is where we run into challenges in qualitative methods because folks who aren't used to qualitative research, they want you to quantify your qualitative research. And sometimes that's not very meaningful. If you've got a large subset of folks that you talk to and you feel like you have a very representative sample, it's one thing to say 80% of participants expressed this issue. That is meaningful. It gives you a sense of, okay, across all of these different participants, they're all having the same problem. Say I'm talking about public health workforce issues and I've interviewed HR directors across 12 states. If each of those HR directors are reporting consistently this one issue, I would then give a little bit of quantification to it and say, this is consistent across 90% of the participants in this study. But otherwise, I'm not going to say 3 people said this and 2 people said this. That's not very meaningful. If you want to quantify something, then you probably need to be using different methods. We're trying to get rich insights, and that's a difficult thing to respond to a reviewer who's asking for you to quantify it. So I'll usually find a really polite way of saying that wouldn't be very meaningful. And so I'm not able to do that. I think if you, one note is if you're working through a manuscript submission and you get reviewer feedback, if there is a mentor or somebody who can help you prepare a response, use other folks who've gone through that process to help you, because there's a bit of an art to responding to reviewers. Not everything that a reviewer says necessarily has to be done. Your editor is going to give you some guidance. Focus on comments number 12 and 37, and please make sure you address reviewer 1's issue about X. The editor is giving you insight about what to really focus on, but not every single thing that a reviewer says you should do can you do. So sometimes you can respond by, that is simply not something that we can address.
That's great. That's great wisdom there. We have almost no time left, but Dr. Scott, if you had any last minute words of wisdom in response to that or anything else?
That question was, I think, for qualitative methods. Otherwise, I would say that, things that I mentioned in my checklist, when people don't provide the information about that, I end up, asking as a reviewer, saying, where is that information? And so that's where I'll leave it.
I think that if I can take 10 seconds, I think that's something that practicing what we preach is always the important thing. I can't tell you how many times I've been dinged on a review for something I ding people on reviews for, and it's infuriating because I'm like, I know better. Anyway, Donnie, do you want to wrap this up?
Sure. So I know that we're at time. I just want to let everyone know that if you are interested in seeing the recording of this, it will be up in a few weeks, hopefully actually within the next week, on our website. If you would like to see the first 2 webinars from this series and register for the 4th and final one, you are able to do that through the link there. We've also placed it in the chat. And with that, we'll end here for today. So thank you for everyone coming and attending and asking great questions. And thank you to all of our presenters for all this valuable information.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.